Hi, everybody, it's Susan. This time I'm going to have a look at the relationship between Harry and Meghan. There's a lot to say. I'm really going to try and keep it short. When I do a relationship reading, it's 90 minutes, and usually we go over. And I'm just going to show you a few of the steps of the different things that I look at in a relationship. And the very first thing can be very helpful, for example, if you don't have a birth time of one or both of the people involved. Then you can just simply establish a chart of when they first met, and you try to get the individual to really pinpoint the time and obviously the place. In this case, I'm going by whatever the media has said about when they first met. That was confirmed in his book because they met on the 1st of July 2016 in London, and apparently a childhood friend of Harry's put them together. I'm guessing that this individual had a feeling that they both resonated in some way, in a similar way, and she was quite right. So her intuition was right. Unfortunately, they resonated with all of the things that bring out often the worst in each other. And this is the problem with relationship chemistry. You can have an individual who has tendencies, but when you put them together with another individual, they tend to gravitate towards the worst tendencies rather than the best. And so we've all seen that throughout life, where one person can bring out the best in somebody and another person can bring out the worst in them, even in the course of the same day. So we're just going to have a look at this meeting chart really quickly because I can't guarantee the time. I've just put it at 6 p.m., assuming they went out for dinner, which it seems like they did. So I'm guessing 6 p.m. We can't really be sure of the ascendant. If it were that, then we could be sure that Mars is on the ascendant, which wouldn't be surprising. And we also see that we've got this opposition. So I'll focus rather on the aspects rather than the houses, but we've got this really strong opposition between Pluto and Venus. So that's boom, that's that fatal attraction right there. And so that's built into the very first moment that they met. A very nice Venus. Venus likes being in Cancer. And of course, the Sun was conjunct Meghan's Mars. So that would have come across as something quite passionate, super passionate. So I'm not going to spend too much time again because the houses are not very clear. But again, just to point out some things. Things that would not have changed, and that is that Jupiter was on Rahu. So Jupiter is expansive, and so is Rahu. There's a big boom when they meet, and that Jupiter happens to be sextile that Venus. So really, really intense. The Jupiter is trining Pluto. That is that bite off more than you can chew kind of aspect. It can be super powerful, and especially with this resonance of Venus as well. That's a big money thing as well. So there's a lot of potentially positive things. And again, the things that will possibly undermine all of this are the individuals and how they relate to each other. So we're going to see that shortly as well. The other thing I want to point out, which is not going to change, is that Neptune is on K2. And it's quite interesting, Neptune on K2, because again, that's another emphasis of not really seeing clearly what's going on. So K2 being in Pisces, which is good, by the way. K2 is actually quite good in Pisces in the sense that it's all about letting go, loss, and shedding something. So this is very much that. If the ascendant is correct, and that's a really big caveat because I don't know the time of their first meeting, this fifth house, of course, is all about love affairs, and so on. And so, Neptune in the fifth is not necessarily good at spotting the the lover. It's a bit too much, sort of pie in the sky and starry-eyed to really make something reliable. Although there is a square between Neptune and Saturn, and so that Neptune-Saturn square can actually be quite grounding. Again, I can't really pronounce too much about the houses because I just don't have the confidence in them in terms of the actual timing. But one other thing that will not change is that Mars is forever and ever going to be in conjunct this Eris, which is intense. Eris is kind of like the female Pluto. And Uranus, Mars-Uranus in conjunct is really unpredictable, very exciting, super passionate, very, very exciting, but not a great signature for a relationship. And so, of course, keeping in mind this is the beginning of a relationship. So there's quite a lot going on in this chart. And again, I would wish that I could tell that it was 6 p.m., but let's imagine if it were around that time, then we would also have Chiron opposite the midheaven, which would be what we could call a reason for them getting together. They're kind of bonding over their wounds in some way or another. But there is definitely a sexual attraction. There's definitely a physical attraction. I just want to show you where Meghan fits into this. So if we put Meghan in the middle and we put the meeting around the outside, we can see how it affected her chart. This is her first meeting with Harry, her first date apparently. And we see, as I mentioned, she's got Mars, her natal Mars is being passed over by the sun. And then we've got Venus, and Venus is at the midpoint between this Mars and Ascendant. So really, really passionate, really interesting. But we've also got that Pluto in the 7th house of partner, marriage, relationship, etc., directly opposing that Venus, and it just adds to this intensity. So there must have been this kind of feeling of karmic, I've already met you somewhere kind of energy. I think that's very, very powerful when Pluto connects so closely to personal planets. Another aspect of this is that Pluto is in a trine to the North Node, and that again is that boom karma, and it's really that fatal attraction energy. I'm going to try not to say that too much, but unfortunately that's just what it is. And so we see that the North Node is actually just about to pass over her Venus. So it is a little bit off. I would want that to be more like 1 or 2 degrees off. So it's about 3 degrees off. But within the next few weeks of their meetings, it would be exact. And so I think what it seems like is that they reconnected quickly after. And certainly that is a very fated aspect. You just can't get around that when the North Node crosses Venus, and then boom, you've got somebody sitting across from you who just lights you up. That's fate. And so there's in many ways a sense that they've come together probably to either restore something from the past or to heal something from the past. And both are probable, both are likely, and I think only time will tell what actually comes of that. Importantly, she has Mars, which is very important for her. Remember, in her first house, always keeping in mind that Mars is her in many ways. It's not because it's in Cancer, but because it's in her first house, and so she's very Martian. And so whatever Mars is doing is always going to highlight her. Now we have Mars trining the Ascendant. That's incredibly forward. It turns out, as far as my God help me, the research that I was doing in the tabloids is that she apparently called him immediately after their date. So she's very forward. That's guaranteed with Mars in the first house. Nothing wrong with that. Just to say that that Mars was trining her Ascendant, and that's something that is there whether or not the timing is right, because that Mars doesn't move that fast. So that would have happened either way. We can also see that Mars was coming up to conjunct her Uranus. And again, I can't know if the Ascendant is correct, but if that were true, then the Ascendant would have also been conjunct Uranus. So within the next couple of days, a week or so, Mars would be conjunct Uranus. And that's quite passionate. It's quite, especially in the 5th house, it's quite sudden passion flaring up, especially in a trine to the Ascendant. And also that Mars is quite strongly opposing Chiron. It's kind of like trauma bonding, coming together with this recognition meeting game, as it were. So there's a lot in this chart which suggests that there is an absolutely genuine love that is passionate, extremely inspired, extremely volatile. The moon on the day was trining the South Node and sextiling the North Node. So again, that's emotional triggers. Oh, and the moon was trining her own moon. So really, really connecting emotionally for her. So let's pass on to Harry, and we'll see then how it was affecting him. So because they have the reverse ascendant-descendant axis, so Meghan is Cancer, Harry is Capricorn, we're going to see a lot of this activity about the other. They see themselves in each other, and they're just mirroring back to each other how they're showing up And again, that can be really good, and it can also be really not great. So we still, of course, we have this Pluto opposition with Venus, and of course Venus is in the 7th house. That's the relationship right there. So we look to Venus for the relationship, for the woman, especially for the female that shows up in your life. And Venus is also describing the relationship. So this is a relationship that's got a Cancer edge to it, a Cancer energy. That is something that is deeply protective. I didn't mention that with Meghan's correspondence here, but it's still very much in the story. Venus in Cancer energy is very much about nurturing and even kind of wanting to get away from everybody else to just kind of hang out together. The sun would have been on his descendant as well, so that's really highlighting something about the relationship. Again, this is really incredibly impactful for him, very, very profound. And more to the point, this Venus is squaring his natal Venus. Now that's where things start getting a little hairy, pardon the pun. With Venus squaring Venus, you're always going to get quite a lot of feistiness. It's going to be certainly the energy of the relationship will be a little bit more invigorating in the beginning. It will feel exciting, but it actually starts to rub against the individual. So that if that were baked into a marriage chart, for example, that would be a really, really bad indicator, because it's edgy. It doesn't understand the Venus of the meeting point, doesn't understand the Venus. And we also see, bless him, Harry, he's got the Neptune in a trine to his descendant and in a sextile to his ascendant. And so he's just not seeing clearly. This is also in the house of communication. So no doubt they did have an immediate sense of connection in terms of conversation, in terms of getting each other, in terms of ideas and thoughts and so on. But this doesn't bode well. For first meetings. That's really challenging, because that's just showing he just really wasn't seeing clearly what was going on. He was deeply smitten, no doubt. We obviously know that, but we can see it on the day that it happened. And so it's very charming, but it can be very dangerous, because Neptune is not letting him see things clearly. Now that applies to so many different aspects of his chart. It's a very wide opposition, because we're looking at pretty much almost 7 degrees of opposition, but that Neptune is retrograde and it's moving towards opposition with his natal Mercury, which is again another message that he's really not seeing things. He's not picking up on the signals. That Neptune is also in a trine to Saturn. Now that's actually good. It saves the day in a way, because that Neptune trining Saturn can be something that is a little more grounded. His hopes and wishes and dreams coming through the 11th house are being lit up in a way by the trining Neptune. But again, it can lead to some fantasy thinking, because it's just way too it's hard to see through the fog of Neptune when it's so exactly, almost exactly in relationship to the ascendant descendant axis, especially when we're talking about an individual. We're not talking about a creative act here. We're not talking about making art, in which case that would be absolutely brilliant. The other aspect is that Neptune is in a square to Chiron, his natal Chiron. And again, look at the nodal conjunctions here. We've got the moon that has just crossed his north node. So there's so much karma here. There's so much real meeting by design. It's very fated. What's been, they've come together in a very, very fated way. What have I missed now? So yeah, and then the other aspect of this is by transit, Chiron is squaring good old Neptune in the 12th. Bless him, Harry, he's just not in a state to really be a good judge. He genuinely is head over heels in love, and in the best of times that's going to throw people off, but in his case he's really not seeing very clearly here, and that is a wound that is being triggered. And that's again another one of those indications that we're seeing kind of a trauma bond, where the indication is that you're going to fix me, you're going to make this better, I'm going to feel better because you're in my life. And of course, almost the opposite is true. All right, so let's ditch the meeting chart, and now we're going to go towards the Synastry chart. So we've got Meghan on the outside and Harry on the inside. So this is how Meghan affects Harry. The synastry, I find, is the most effective way to see what's really going on in a relationship. I will always look to that as the sort of principal understanding of a relationship. Shortly, we'll also see the composite chart, but I do feel the synastry really tells us a more impactful story. Because we're looking at how one person is relating to another and how the lives are affected directly by that. So the way Meghan is showing up very strongly in Harry's chart is, of course, her descendant is showing up in the ascendant. That's because they have this Cancer Capricorn axis. Now, again, it shows up Mars on his descendant exactly to within 5 arc minutes of a degree. This is all on its own. I would say that is enough to warn a couple that they will need to understand how to avoid conflict in the relationship. This is a passive aggressive Mars in Cancer. So there can be a lot of underhanded ways of dealing with aggression and frustration in the marriage. And of course, it's also going to bring some real sexual interest. It's definitely going to bring some stimulation to the relationship. Another way of looking at that is with Mars in the 7th house. Your partner makes you really busy. You're maybe doing sports together, being really super active together, which of course they are as well. But nonetheless, we want to consider that that's also going to affect the relationship long term emotionally, especially because this Mars is ruled by the moon. And the moon, of course, is all about the mind and emotions. Now, this Mars is also in conjunct Harry's Mars, and it's in conjunct his Uranus as well. That's really challenging. That is super destabilizing in a relationship. It's another way of saying that there are going to be fights, there are going to be problems. It's going to show up sooner or later, and it probably already has. Although, because there's all this activity, this lovely Venusian energy of Libra that doesn't like to show, one doesn't argue in public when one has Libra in the 10th house, then you have this feeling that, okay, they're just not showing it, but I can't imagine that they haven't had a good few arguments already. So I'm going to go through a few really important aspects that show actually quite a nice bond, a nice chemistry, because every relationship has good and bad. It's just that some relationships have bad in a way that is quite harmful and really difficult to manage, difficult to maintain over time, and some just have, the day-to-day irritations that are easy to ignore or at least overcome. So Harry's sun is sextile Meghan's ascendant, and that gives a really, really good connection. So sun sextiling the ascendant, that's a really nice connection. That will be, whether it's friends or lovers, that will be a relationship where people just feel each other in a really nice way, just really, really coming out nicely. And his moon, down here in Taurus, is also sextiling the ascendant. So again, another really, really good aspect to have in a relationship. It's something that that brings out the best in emotionally. It can make you feel really comfortable with the person. You feel like you've met, you already know each other. It's almost like you can have this feeling of not needing to explain anything to each other, which is really lovely. Very, very nice. Lots of harmony there. And of course, we've got Harry's Venus. It's a very broad sextile, but so almost 12 degree Sun and almost 18 degree Venus. So it's still valid in a natal chart. That's still valid. And that, again, is just beautiful in a relationship. You definitely want to see features like that. That's what brings people together. It's what makes them feel good together. They feel really, really nice in each other's company, or certainly in the beginning they do. There's a real attraction there. There's a real serious attraction. So Harry's sun is also in a broad conjunction with Venus. So Venus is at the midpoint actually between his sun and Mercury. So I'm sure that they have non-stop long chats and endless discussions into the night about all kinds of things. Especially as this is lighting up Harry's 9th house, this will be about future plans and what his purpose is. And I'm sure she has him all lit up about feeling good about himself and feeling he has a purpose. He has a kind of a role to play, which I think he was lacking for many years. Now it's, again, a broad conjunction, but in a natal chart, and especially for a marriage chart, we want to see any kind of connection there. And that, I think that's very, very positive. So again, there's a lot of compatibility, a lot of things that really work in their favor. And then, of course, we see that her Jupiter is, again, it's a very broad conjunction. It's 11 degrees, but we can still look at that in the chart. We see Jupiter and we see the fated Pluto as well. So we see that there's a big sense of expanded role in Harry's concept of himself. This is really very much about marriage. This is all of her energy that is being brought into the house of marriage for him. And of course, this would be wonderful except for that Pluto. And that Pluto is really the thing that causes quite a lot of difficulty there. That Pluto, 4 degrees off pretty much her Venus. So there are quite a few pitfalls as well, although they can go both ways. They cut both ways. So Harry's Mars is conjunct Neptune. And again, that's kind of not seeing things clearly. There's an initial romantic appeal that's very, very strong, but not seeing things clearly once again. And so Harry is, in many ways, I think, going to sense very soon, if it's not already happening, that there's a lot of deception going on. I mean, I find it hard to believe that he can listen to her saying things that are not true and actually not have that shift his sense of who she is to him. Of course, the same can be said of him because he's got all of this 12th house, especially Mars and Neptune going on, and that's quite tenuous relationship to the truth, we can say. So both of them have a signature for not being entirely honest or truthful, but for different reasons. Whereas with Meghan, for example, it's much more that she wants to be seen and to be heard. And so she's kind of willing to say and do whatever it takes. And with Harry, it's because he's not really seeing clearly. And he's just almost like wishful thinking. And so it's more like the way that a 5-year-old would lie. It's that kind of naive, I want to believe this, therefore it's true. It's kind of like Santa Claus logic in a way. So we have also a very interesting square between the moon and Jupiter. So Harry's Jupiter is also squaring Meghan's moon to within less than 1.5 degrees. That's really, really tight. That's a bite off more than you can chew kind of aspect. And again, they bring out excess in each other. This is another way of looking at the Jupiter and Venus and Pluto and Venus aspects, the conjunctions, because they are really... they're like egging each other on in a way to just keep getting bigger and bigger, and it's very it puffs you up. It's a kind of a, well, one could say a narcissistic or egotistical, or just a bit hubristic in the energy. And not to say that that's an immediate result. If this is an aspect that shows up in somebody's chart, you would want to see a number of things pointing to the same thing. It's not sufficient to say you've got Jupiter squaring the moon and therefore, but it can be emotional excess at the very least. But in their case, of course, this is magnified by all the busyness and everything else that's happening as well. Equally, Harry has this natally. Harry has that sextile between Jupiter and Pluto. Go to the other video about Harry to see his chart in more detail. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that here. So it's his tendency to go overboard anyway, and then she brings that out in spades then with this Jupiter moon. The Jupiter-Saturn is actually quite good for them in the sense that it can create a good foundation that can be really helpful. It can be something that actually stabilizes the relationship, but it can also be a break. It can be something that slows things down or is a bit of a drag. Because it does cause a little bit of friction between what one wants to do and what one hopes hopes to do. Yeah, and then the last thing here about the moon and Jupiter is that this can lead to high expectations. Jupiter moon in general will be pulling up a lot of expectations, and again, it's that excess. It's about what going over the top, but it's not really good for long term because you're always going to end up disappointed. What the moon wants is being amplified. There's this kind of tension between expectations and the reality, and there's always going to be a certain amount of disappointment. And I would say that particularly because this is Jupiter in Capricorn, and so by definition, as you'll, if you've already seen his chart analysis, you've seen that that's in detriment, and that's not going to bring good results for him. Another way of saying that is that Meghan, if we think of her as represented by the moon, her emotions and so on, is taking advantage of this Jupiter, so that can lead to feeling a little bit put upon in relationships. So that doesn't show up right away. It shows up over time, because it's kind of like it's a very deep thing when we're talking about the moon. It's emotional stuff, and so we're not always aware of what's going on there. It's the mind and the emotions. So we see Harry's Uranus is sextile her moon as well. So that's something that is a bit broader. It's about 3, almost 4 degrees, but still very emotionally unstable, very, very hot and cold, on again, off again kind of energy. And that's especially Meghan will be the one to appear more inconsistent, but it's not necessarily only her. We can't say it's her fault, as it were. She's more radical, and this can lead to indiscretion as well. The moon and Uranus in this, it's kind of like a blabbermouth kind of thing, or saying things, speaking out about things that shouldn't be spoken about, usually emotional things, the kind of thing that you want to hide, but Harry's doing that. It might be because of this aspect, actually, that he feels so much encouragement to speak out about his wound, about his childhood. An aspect like this will not age well. It's not going to be easy. The moon is also sextiling the south node, and again, that's really not easy, because that's this energy of draining. The south node is what is being drained away, and the moon is trining the north node and Chiron, and so this is almost like she triggers his wound. It's almost like she brings out all of the pain and symbolizes all of the pain in his life in a way that just keeps pushing at it. It's that the moon, her moon, is in the midpoint between Chiron and the north node, or just beyond the midpoint. So always tugging at that wound. So over time, that becomes wearisome. That's perhaps very interesting. In the beginning, it feels like somebody's really noticing you and paying attention, but over time, it becomes really, really wearisome. Meghan's Chiron is conjunct Harry's moon. Harry has a lovely moon, as we saw already in his chart, and of course I've got a separate video for Meghan's astrology as well. If you're not sure, you can have a look at that. It tells a lot about what makes her tick. And her Chiron is on his moon. So it's interesting, because Chiron in Taurus is very ambivalent around money. It kind of goes hot and cold around money and whether we want money or not. And she made a big song and dance about what she was wearing when she met her future brother and sister-in-law. She emphasized that she was wearing, like, I think, no shoes or cutoffs, or she was wearing just an old ripped t-shirt or something, as if that were like a good thing. And it's kind of like pretending that she couldn't care less about money, when in reality that's actually a big thing for her. Chiron is actually in a money house for her. It's in the 11th house, and that's all part of socially fitting in. And so that's a big wound for her. So it's not true that she wouldn't care about money, although she does vacillate back and forth, And then to have Chiron conjunct the moon, this is all of that pity party that they bring together. It's all of this energy of, look at how the world is treating us, this whole very, very powerful victim energy. It's exacerbated because that Chiron is really almost exactly in a trine to his sun. And so the luminaries, the most important aspects of his sense of self, are being triggered by this wounding. That is her own wounding around value and worth and all of the things that make her feel insecure. And he's picking up on that energy, and so it's triggering him as well. So really not great. It can be very good for healing, and it looks like he's done quite a lot of healing over the years. And so she might have been that instigation that had him doing quite a lot of healing. I don't know if that was starting already before he met her, but nonetheless, she would help with that. That would certainly be a help for him. So Harry's Saturn is in a very strong sextile to Meghan's natal Venus, And that Venus is also in a sextile to the midheaven for Harry. And so she really makes him look good. That's one of the ways that you can read that. It's that she makes him look better. She makes him feel better about himself and about how he shows up in the world. And this is actually a really interesting compatibility feature, because Venus trining or sextiling Saturn is good for stability. Even Venus conjunct Saturn can be good for stability. However, over time, any Venus-Saturn aspects tend to kind of deplete Venus of the joy and the ease. And so, in principle, Harry's Saturn can bring a lot of stability to this Venus. That could be one of the ways that could look. But because there's such a lot of instability in Meghan's chart as it is, it's probably not enough to do that. Nonetheless, he will be the sort of voice of reason, I think, believe it or not, in their relationship, and he will be the one to kind of slow things down or put a damper on, for example, spending. This is the other aspect of that Venus being aspected by her planets, is that there could be just this kind of excess spending, just it's way over the top, that can be undermining both of them, and it'll be a source of friction for both of them. Her North Node is in his 8th house, along with the Sun and Mercury. So there's definitely a lot of talking about shared resources and what to do with that. That's certainly a big focal point in his experience of her. So I think there is something to be said for him perhaps stabilizing that a little bit, but I'm not sure that at the moment that's a big issue. I don't think that they will find over time that they can sustain their particular lifestyle unless they find some kind of new way of being, because there's only so much that you can milk out of celebrity gossip, basically, which is what this boils down to, this whole thing. I don't know if you can hear it in my voice that I'm kind of done with the royal family. I just feel like I want to wrap up because I started this. I kind of launched into this all by my own doing, I have to admit. But I'm really kind of done with them all. And I'm just going to wrap this up so that people can have the bigger picture of the scene. And I suspect, however, I'm going to have to come back to it around the coronation. The other aspect of this excess in the relationship is also the ascendant. I didn't really fully touch on that, but the ascendant is also square Jupiter. So same thing. And then again, the ascendant is square because it's all conjunct, it's square Saturn and the moon as well, but of course in a much lesser powerful square. But nonetheless, that also does create unrealistic expectations, unrealistic goals, hopium. You could call it hopium. But it's also very uplifting, very positive. So, again, this is a really inspiring relationship for both of them. There's a lot of really interesting draw. I don't think that it has longevity, and we'll see that in the transits probably when we look at the wedding chart. And because Harry's ascendant is square Saturn, it really can be experienced as limiting. So, it's her Saturn. She's going to be the one that has to do the hard work, as it were, to be more reliable, to work on commitment. And that we see also in this Uranus sextile moon. So it's 5 degrees off. The Uranus sextiling the moon, it's again that instability, but it's also, I think it's going to be hard because Meghan has that natally, this tendency to kind of disappear, just kind of come and go in relationships, and I think that's going to be undermining the relationship over time. So Harry's Saturn is trining her Mars. That can be very good for longevity. It can be very good for grounding as well, for giving some real longevity to a project, for example, anything that they want to work on together. But it is also like hard work. It means that they'll get there by doing hard work. It's Mars is, after all, in his house of relationship, and it's something that is directly impacting his Saturn, which is on his midheaven. So this is all about the marriage in Harry's chart. And the other aspect of this Saturn here is that it is in a really strong square, a fixed square, with Meghan's Sun. And that's not easy. Sun square Saturn is certainly not sexy. That's one of the things that will be a bit of a killjoy. It can be that it contributes to that karmic feeling. It can contribute. And again, don't, if you have this aspect with somebody, don't think automatically that this is a bad thing, or it will be probably felt as karmic as well for you, or sort of fated in some way. But don't think of it as necessarily bad. It's got to, the whole picture has to be seen. So don't freak out over any one of these aspects if you have them in your own experience. But it can lead to a lot of restriction, and it can lead to a lot of criticism, and that kind of nitpickiness, which I think we see anyway between, you know, the Virgo Sun and Mercury on Harry's side and the Virgo Venus on Meghan's side. So it is indeed a challenge that needs to be overcome. It's like a feeling that they are in this together, come thick or thin. Of course, that's in principle what every marriage is supposed to be like, but it really gives off the feeling that they are working hard at something together, that this is not an easy kind of cakewalk. There can also be a feeling of lack or fears, and especially because that's pulling at Harry's 8th house of fears and unconscious programming. So she definitely brings out a lot of 8th house energy for him. So I suspect that this is a real test of long-term harmony. Their honeymoon period will end sooner or later, if it hasn't already. To be honest, I would be surprised. And that is going to leave more of a residue of struggle, because the initial impact is much more in the excitement of the relationship, but the underlaying, you know, the deeper aspects, the certainly the deeper emotional aspects and the deeper psychological aspects are really hard. They're hard to overcome. You know, Pluto is here squaring Meghan's nodes. This is really difficult. Pluto squaring the nodes is again one of these fatal attraction things. There's so many of them here. So that alone is really shaking things up for both of them. They're here in this really heavy karma that they have come to resolve somehow between them. So Harry's sun, of course, is squaring, very powerfully squaring her Neptune. So of all the other things that Neptune is doing, when it squares the sun, then that's really an element of delusion. You know, it's the fact that it's already been, there's been so many aspects that suggest that he's just not seeing clearly, whether it be from the meeting chart or things around the moon and so on. But this is really the kicker. This is the one that says, now, you know, Harry, wake up. But you know, they have all these really harmonious aspects, so it's tempting. You know, they see each other as each other's savior, I suspect, or at least Harry sees her as his savior, especially with all that energy of Neptune in the 12th. But again, that suggests with Neptune in the 12th, that's Meghan's Neptune, then she's lacking substance to contribute to that energy of what Harry is looking for. Now, again, to say up front, he's lacking substance already, that there's something that he's not really fully able to engage with in this lifetime. But this shows up in his chart as her, so that Neptune is emphasizing this whole confusion, delusion thing. So I think this also can lead to a dissipation of desire. It just kind of fizzles out over time. That Neptune is also in conjunct the moon. Not great. Again, an emotional lack of clarity, a lack of emotional understanding over time. So this can prevent him from actually achieving his goals. So he's got these big ideas, these really big pie in the sky ideas, but it's preventing him from achieving his goals. His sun is also in a relatively close sextile to Uranus, and so that Uranus is shaking him up, no doubt. That's something that really, of course, is going to transform him. But it's not a stable energy, so he is often kind of having to adjust on the fly to whatever Meghan is doing. And that's in the house of society, in the 11th house of hopes and dreams, you know, how he connects with society. And certainly we can see that in real time. So Harry's moon is in what is called a sesquiquadrate sesquiquadrate. A sesquiquadrate is 135-degree aspect. So it's similar to an inconjunct, but the inconjunct, for example, is by degree. So we have an inconjunct between Pluto and Harry's moon, for example, whereas the sesquiquadrate is 135 degrees. So it's a quadrant plus, and so it's a quadrant plus half of a quadrant. And this is where we find the moons colliding in a way. Doesn't really stand out in many ways. I don't really look at that in a natal chart, but I absolutely look at that in a chart where you're comparing people. That's something that can really bring out the worst in people. It is major differences in the way that they feel nurtured, in the way that they do their nurturing. The moon always should line up in a chart in a way that makes a person feel like they're relating emotionally with ease to the other person. Otherwise, there's always going to be tension, friction. So you've got the moon in the earth element and for Harry, and you've got the moon in the air element for Meghan, and that if you think of it like a desert, again, over time, in the beginning you don't notice these things, but over time it doesn't really age well. So there is this kind of feeling of not being given. A moon is all about nourishment. It's all about the wet. The moon symbolizes something that is cool and wet. And this is not going to appear in their emotional connection with each other. So over time, that really shows up as finding it difficult to empathize with each other, not having an easy rapport. There's this feeling of just being fated. It's like you're pulled together almost in a way that you can't control. Not that it's almost like against your better judgment. Okay. So I wonder if that sometimes Harry was actually feeling a little pinch in his heart every now and then. I wonder. So it does actually produce quite an easy rapport. It's good for social rapport, for example. And it does lead to this fated quality, this feeling like we're here together for something. We're here in a way that is pulling us together. But it can lead to emotional conflicts because it's so different. And that I would say that's even more powerfully so because of that inconjunct with Pluto. So much of the chart suggests that there's instability in the relationship, like we saw with the Uranus or the nodal axis and so on. There's just so much going on in the chart around things just not being long-term or stable. And that's going against what both of them actually crave natally. So again, watch the videos on Harry and Meghan's astrology. They'll be put somewhere at the end of the reel maybe. But definitely, if you're interested in knowing more about them, if you haven't seen them already, you'll understand more about what they're each looking for. And what is happening in this relationship is they're finding what they think is going to be the resolution to their pain. And of course, that can go for most relationships. This is not exclusive to them. But they're finding really the opposite of what they really crave. And this is more like what they're finding is what is familiar to them rather than what they actually are looking for, what they need. So there's a lot of instability that is going to challenge their desire, their long-term desire for emotional and psychological stability. Harry has Eris natally opposing his Venus, so he's comfortable with being uncomfortable around issues of powerful women, issues of home, because Eris in the fourth house is representing home. It's disruption at home, challenges at home. She's right on that. She's right there. So that Eris is also triggering his own, as well as triggering Venus in his chart. So that there is a lot that shows up that is poking at his attitudes towards women and relationships in general, but also poking at his family. And this Eris is, in both counts, is squaring the descendant. And Eris squaring the descendant is a troublemaker. That's really hard. So here we have that depiction of Harry as creating some drama around home, and then he brings the wife in to do exactly the same. So that must not be very comfortable for anybody, I'd say, for the last, 4 or 5 years. Yeah, so that Eris is also in conjunct Saturn, which is again going to shake up roles of tradition and expectations around tradition. And Eris, very importantly, is almost in an exact trine, just about 1.5 degrees, something like that, with Mars. natally. So that's volatile. That's extremely volatile. We see that natally for Harry. He is like that. He's volatile. That's no surprise. But she's also bringing that out of him. And that's not going to change. And so, equally, his Eris is triggering her Mars. There's just so much of this that is talking about volatility in the relationship, emotional volatility, and so on. Even if that also encompasses sexual passion and, sexual attraction, of course, that's really powerful in their chart as well. But it's not enough to sustain a relationship. And especially because so much of what they seem to be here for is about being a victim. It's like this, this victim energy that is being cultivated in so many different ways, whether it be through Chiron or through Neptune, this kind of wishy-washy, woe is me kind of energy that jumps out of so many aspects of the chart. And again, it's really the overriding emotional energy. Again, it's not going to be sustained beyond that honeymoon period. I think it's going to be really, really hard. Let's swap them around and see now what it's like when for Meghan to have Harry in her life. So Meghan is on the inside now, and Harry is on the outside. We'll just see a little bit how that affects her life. Then we'll move on to the composite chart and the marriage chart. So Harry's Pluto is squaring her natal north node and Mercury, as we already saw. That Mercury square Pluto is something that is really powerful as well in terms of a deep mental connection. They kind of get each other in a way that is very profound. So the Pluto aspects to the chart are not always negative. They're probing. They're very deep. And given that he has Pluto in Scorpio, that's what he's looking for. Also, he wants depth of connection. But the problem is, of course, he's not really going to find it in Meghan. You can say a lot of things about Mercury in Leo, but deep is not usually one of them. So Mercury in Leo is often very happy-go-lucky and very social and very optimistic and inspiring and so on. But it's rarely confused with anyone who's very profound, and especially with Rahu there. That's something that will augment that tendency of Mercury already to be kind of on the surface of things. So as we saw, Harry's Mars is also square her natal Venus, and that's very, very good for a relationship. Of course, you've got this lovely intensity. In her case, his Mars, though, is in the 6th house, and that's everyday life. There's a lot of disruption to her everyday life because of Harry. Of course, you can say that would apply virtually to any marriage, but in her case, she feels this very, very intensely every day. He just disrupts what she thought was going to be her everyday life. And again, she's asking for it. She wanted it, but just to keep in mind that can't be easy. That creates, again, just Mars and Uranus alone in the 6th house will create some intensity around the day-to-day life. There will be conflicts with people in their lives, employees and staff and each other. There's going to be tension, and then that throws this axis, this whole energy of the 6th house, 12th house axis of health, that throws her axis into a completely different balance, because where she previously had Neptune in the 6th, now she's got a lot going on in her unconscious part of the chart, healing very deep wounds from deep inside, which is something that Harry is pulling out of her. That's something that he's almost obliging her to do. There's no getting around that. And that's, in her case, that's in Gemini. That's with regards to siblings as well. Gemini, even if it's the 12th house, it can be seen as siblings, representing issues around siblings. And then we see also the other aspect of this with the 3rd house is communication. And so Harry is pulling a lot of energy into her house of communication. And that is also in the really interesting aspect to her day-to-day house. So her 6th house of activity and day-to-day work is becoming quite challenging. That brings out the aspects of the confrontation. The 6th house is open enemies. The 6th house is issues that require some kind of resolution, contracts or engagements that require some kind of negotiation or resolution. So Harry's actually coming in and kind of messing that up. for her. And he's bringing some nice things. Obviously, that's Harry right there. Jupiter is the husband in a woman's chart, and there he is, right in her seventh house. So, boom, perfect. But again, the challenge being that that this is actually not an easy relationship. It requires an enormous amount of adjustment on both of their parts. So Harry's Venus comes to her fourth house, which is beautiful because it's ruling that fourth house, and so it just makes her home and her sense of security even better. In the sense of finances, for example, that will really illuminate that. This can be something extremely beneficial in terms of the look of her home, the quality of her home, which I think would anyway be very good with Venus there on the fourth. Um, that's one of the reasons that Cancers have such a reputation for being such homebodies. Is because the home is such a haven. It's all about feeling comfortable and being beautiful and being sort of in all of that Venusian energy. And so Harry's just magnifying that a million times. And they lived in really lovely places, even if they had the gall apparently to criticize the cottage that they were given to live in, and because it was quite small. But I digress. So Harry actually is, in terms of Harry's heiress, Harry's actually provoking a kind of an original issue that she has with Eris here on the midheaven and Eris squaring Mars. And so Harry is just kind of highlighting that, it's bringing that out. And so any troubles that she's had with people in her career or in the general public are being exacerbated by that. Now, this is minor. I'm not going to really emphasize things like Eris. I certainly wouldn't give it too much stock if it weren't in a close conjunction with some of their planets. And in this, I'm looking at anything that's up to 10 degrees as something worth looking at. So if this were way off, I wouldn't actually be too interested in it. But it's definitely worth noting that this is triggering some aspect of where she kind of puts her foot in it in terms of how she shows up in the world. And Harry is unwittingly triggering that in her. Harry's Eris shows up in her 10th house of career, and that is trining her second house sun. And that, of course, will enhance her finances. So that can be something that actually, again, here we're seeing them market certain things about, the gossipy side of their life for money. Basically, it's all this tell-all Netflix or tell-all books and so on. So she's milking this pretty well, where her sun in the second house with Rahu and Mercury are quite covetous. They're quite money interested, let's say, in money. Could be very, very, very beneficial, except that it's done in a way that's quite toxic. Eris is going to always provoke some kind of irritability or challenge, putting some kind of spanner in the works. It's often also about revealing hypocrisy. Interesting, because it's almost like one could say that Harry's Eris is revealing Meghan's hypocrisy in the way that she shows up in the world. I'm trying not to be mean, but these are aspects that really do jump out, and so it's worth just looking at it in terms of how the astrology is showing up. So again, we see how Harry's midheaven is sextiling her Venus, and I don't think I've mentioned that before, but that is also an energy of a kind of, again, excess ego drives, and especially because that's his midheaven. It's very much about his aims and goals. In this case, something very, very powerful. We do see that their midheavens are in conjunct, and that's not great for achieving goals. Actually, it's they're not entirely at. They kind of go at cross purposes in some ways. So. Yeah, there is a lot that is a kind of back and forth where things can go to excess very quickly, like with the Jupiter squaring Jupiter aspect, for example, that's just kind of excess, and even though that brings good fortune, it's just too much. It just is, it can be very very good fortune, very good for the relationship, and so on. Certainly makes home feel more comfortable, and makes relationship feel comfortable. But it can also just keep expanding things, and there is a need, because it's a square, there's a kind of a constant need for adjustment, and partly because, of course, that Jupiter is also squaring the Saturn and Moon. Constant readjustment around life goals and what needs to be this direction, and that can mean that they really need a kind of a regular reality check. And I say that without irony. I think that would be something I would advise a client, for example, is just to every now and then maybe step back and assess what it is that you're doing, and is it working for both of you, and is it leading you both to a better place, or is it just more of more? And when we see Harry's Uranus and Mars trining that midheaven, that's just really, really big, big goals. That's like, I want to change the world. I want to, rule the world kind of thing. And this is really a very powerful aspect because it's shaking up her 6th house of everyday life and the 10th house of career. So they have big plans and big goals. They have a really big sense of what they want to achieve. There is a lack of grounding, though, a lack of realism that would prevent that. And so as we saw, of course, that moon, Harry's moon, is on her Chiron and then in conjunct Pluto. Again, that's this fatal attraction. It's very manipulative, very dark, moon-Pluto stuff. That's already psychological stuff in the 4th house with Pluto in the 4th. Again, check that video on Meghan if you want more details, but that's not easy psychologically. So there's a lot of really heavy psychological stuff going on. Basically, if I see this, all these tensions and things that are underlying this, and especially with these Pluto aspects, I see that there can be a tendency for this love and the passion and everything that brought them together in the first place to really sour, and it can lead to actual hatred. So it wouldn't surprise me that the next book out is like How I Survived My Marriage or whatever by one or both of them, because we're talking about these aspects that are really intense. It's aspects with Mars and Pluto and Mars and Moon and Pluto and Moon and Mars and Mars. It's big stuff. It's not comfortable, and it pulls up a lot of the original wounding. Right. So let's move on. We're going to have a look at the composite chart. So a composite chart is very interesting. It can give you a glimpse into the purpose of a relationship. I wouldn't describe it as the relationship itself. I think that's only really only seen in the synastry, I find. The composite, though, can give you a really good sense of what they've come together to do. And then again, we're seeing some really powerful, very interesting things happening here. So here we have then a lot of activity, again, very nice actually, Libran activity in the 1st house. We do see them, obviously that's, if you think of the 1st house as the couple, we're seeing the couple showing up in this very Venusian way, and lo and behold, Venus is there. Venus is conjunct Mars. Even I go with out of sign conjunctions. I find they do tell us a lot. I know that in traditional astrology, or at least especially in Indian astrology, that's a big taboo, but I find that we're dealing with a paradigm here that is this is not fixed reality. So if the planets are less than a degree away, it's telling us something. And so we do have this Mars-Venus connection, which is very clear. That is their whole sort of main motive in getting together is passion, sexual passion, and the whole male-female energy is very, very strong in them. That whole vibe is very, very strong. And then, of course, we've got the drama. So then we've got Saturn, Pluto. That's heavy in the 1st house. That's really, really hard stuff. So this is why there's just so much, so much learning for them. So much that they will have to overcome, both as a team, because we're talking about Libra, which is the relationship, but of course each individual for their own reasons, as we've seen from the other charts. But this is really what they're coming here together to figure out. This Saturn Pluto it's really about finding a new path. It's really finding a new way, trying to overcome. But it's going to be hard because Saturn Pluto in the 1st house is really heavy, very, very heavy. Eris is on the descendant. Again, that's this disharmony, Eris disharmony on the descendant of the composite chart. It's again not showing up in a nice way. And that is it's ruled by Mars. It's not a nice Mars in the sense that it's not only in the 12th house, but it's Mars in Virgo, which is not a happy camper because it tends to be, again, hypercritical, fussy over details, and not super tolerant. So I think, again, over time, it's just not going to be a viable relationship. We do see Mercury in the 11th in Leo, and God, does that ever show up in their couple? So they're certainly here to broadcast something about themselves to the rest of the world that we see in spades. The 12th house sun is quite hidden, so there's also this, again, that energy of potentially healing, or coming together for purposes of intimacy, purposes of behind the scenes connection, and of course that's a perfectly valid reason to be together, but it does conflict with a lot of the things that they are actually doing in their relationship, pushing themselves out into the public eye. And then that is sextiling the North Node, which is in Cancer. So again, the North Node in Cancer is referring to this family as well. Can we establish a family in the 10th house? The Moon in Cancer, very much about wanting a family, wanting to establish that family in the 10th house. But here we have this Moon in the 10th house that's showing up, which is very much about how you show up in the world. And this is hard. Moon in the 10th house, it's like their purpose is to show up in the world, but the Moon makes that inconsistent. It's waxing and waning in terms of their public acceptance and their public popularity. The Moon is in a nice energy, at least, with Jupiter. Jupiter's in the 2nd house, and that's all about money. So we can say that they are certainly here in harmony, to think about money together, to create money together, to develop their income, develop their money. And they both relate to that emotionally. And then, of course, the house of communication with Neptune there, that's again another aspect of dishonesty or deception, not being really clear in communication, a bit fantastical thinking, and that is in a square with 12th house Mars. The Uranus in the 3rd house is a lot about siblings. Uranus and Neptune are both affecting the house of siblings. And they're both having issues with siblings that is challenging the foundation of those relationships, that if it hasn't already completely damaged them. Equally, that is in opposition to Chiron, and so we're seeing very, very powerfully how Chiron in Gemini, all about siblings, is in this affected by this Uranus in the 3rd house of siblings, and things changing. So this relationship is changing, relationship with their siblings. I'm not going to dwell too much more on this chart because I want to see now the marriage chart, which I think also shows very strongly the energy that they were coming in with. So the marriage chart has some really powerful aspects as well. It has retrograde Jupiter, which I would not want to see in a wedding chart. I would want to see Jupiter going direct, but okay, it's not possible. Jupiter is retrograde something like 4 months of the year. It's not always possible for that to be direct. Other aspects like the moon and so on would want to be very important. Now we do see a beautiful moon. We see a Cancer moon, and that is really good fortune. It does bring a lot of a feeling of security, feeling of emotional connectedness, and so on. But it's all a little bit thrown off because that moon is almost exactly by 2 degrees opposite Pluto. So moon opposition Pluto is, again, it's just that not great. It's emotional. It's intense, profound, deep emotional stuff that is being triggered by this marriage. Not easy to live with. Saturn is in a trine to the Ascendant. Also, can be very good for support, in a sense, a very strong Saturn, although it's retrograde Saturn. This Saturn and Pluto are in the 5th house of the wedding chart, and so again it just shows you that 5th house, that's the house of love, sex and love affairs. It's another way of saying joie de vivre and all the things that are fun, and it's not in great shape because of this Saturn and Pluto. It puts a real damper on that, and it makes it more like hard work again. It can be profound and deep again. There's so many aspects of that we've already seen in their chart, but it's not easy stuff. And that Saturn is, of course, it's trining the ascendant, it's also sextiling the descendant, and this Saturn is also in a sextile with Neptune, as is Pluto. So that Neptune and Saturn Pluto is causing a little bit of confusion. Neptune in the house of relationship is suggesting this is a bit of a fairy tale, and that's not necessarily going to last. It's not really the kind of aspect that one would hope for in a wedding chart, because it's all about illusion. It's not stable. There's nothing really that you can grasp. Still, because Venus is almost at the end of Gemini, she's almost in the first degree of Cancer. That is pretty nice. I mean, that's really supportive. It's really lovely. It does produce a lot of really good vibes, good energy. But that Venus is also in a sextile with Uranus, and again, that's destabilizing. Now that Uranus at 0 degrees, I wrote a blog about this in April or May of 2018, about how that is exactly on the Queen's Sun and Charles' Moon. That's really disruptive. That energy, as I said in that blog, I'll post a link below to that blog. That energy of Uranus at the 0 degree point is triggering a real instability in the royal family, and that is what this wedding did. And so it's something that is always going to be there. It's again, as I said at the time, that clearly they didn't have an astrologer, or they would never have allowed for this. They would have postponed it or asked them to do it a bit earlier or something, because this is just a disaster. It's a very exact. Yeah, so again, this is something that really stands out, that the sun on the midheaven is wonderful for a wedding chart. That's beautiful as an aspect to have, really highlights the couple. They're in the public eye. We see that the marriage puts them in the public eye. It's really brilliant. It's a great aspect to have in a relationship chart. The sun, however, is also squaring the ascendant-descendant axis. Again, it's an out-of-sign square, but it is a square, and it's worth paying attention to those things in an important chart like this. And then, of course, that sun and midheaven are trining Pluto. So that's, again, super intense, very transformational. This is really hard work. This is definitely going to throw a wrench into the lives of everyone concerned, because this is it's a lot of stuff to be dealt with, a lot of stuff to be healed. There's that Eris again. She is in square. That was a long-term feature. Eris has been squaring Pluto for many, many years, off and on. And so that just happened to be where she was actually in kind of far away from Pluto. So they've been in some exact squares in 2019, 20, and 21, I think. And then, of course, we also have Chiron in the 8th house, and Chiron in the 8th house is that healing about healing the self, healing who am I, and doing that where? Through marriage. So we've got Eris and Chiron in the house of marriage, and this is certainly one of the journeys that they're on, is to heal themselves, and apparently this marriage is one of the vehicles that they're going to do it through. Chiron is in a sextile to Mars. That's really difficult energy as well. It's very painful. Not an easy aspect at all. Very emotionally disruptive, especially from the 6th to the 8th house. So I'm going to look at how the book release actually affects their wedding chart, because I think this is quite interesting to see that there are some points that are being triggered here, and how. So the outer ring is the book release, and the inner ring is the wedding. So here we're seeing that the sun is lighting up the Pluto in the marriage chart, and Mercury is right in the midpoint between Saturn and Pluto. So this is quite challenging in their relationship, the house of love. It's definitely highlighting by the sun shining a light on Pluto, on this kind of wounding that they have, which is very much where what Pluto is representing, this need for transformation, and where that's going to happen. This is emphasized as well because we've got Venus on the south node, and this is something I really, when I saw that, I thought, that's probably one of the things that is maybe one of the strongest indicators that this will change their relationship for a long time to come. Venus is so closely conjunct that south node, it's almost uncanny. And again, if you're trying to do something and you have an astrologer, ask them how to do it with great success rather than blowing everything up. We also see that the North Node in the house of publishing and foreign relationships and higher learning and all that kind of stuff is directly on their Mercury. And so that's all about talking and explaining and so on. Very, very karmic, this whole thing. It's definitely going to transform that aspect of the marriage for sure. Uranus has moved on, of course, in that ninth house, and it's in the midpoint between the midheaven and Mercury, and so it's kind of stirring the pot between how they show up in the world and what they're talking about, which is emphasized by that North Node. And then this Mars is in the 10th house. Mars in the 10th house is incredibly ambitious. Mars is something that is always in the 10th house going to be risking irritation on the part of other people who feel you might be overly ambitious or overly putting yourself out there. And with Mars pretty much stationing at this point, it turns direct on the 12th of January. So at the point of the book release, it's actually stationing. Slow. It's really intense energy in that 10th house. So I think, again, a symbol that there might be quite a few enemies created out of this whole procedure. Mars is also in a square to the ascendant of the chart, although it's 6 degrees off. That's still really worth paying attention to. It's actually, a little bit less than 6, maybe 5.5 degrees off. So definitely still strong enough that it makes a big difference, and so that makes a T-square with the ascendant-descendant axis. So this is going to cause disruption, I think, in their marriage, this book release. And it's going to be something that's lasting disruption. These are major, very, very close, exact conjunctions and very tight frustrations, So we have Jupiter on Chiron in the 8th house. Of course, remembering the 8th house is all about our fears and our deeper psychological nature. And Jupiter on Chiron is always going to be like maxing out on all of that. It's really triggering, in a way, the emotional quality of their original marriage, triggering the sort of need for healing through this marriage. And Jupiter is really exposing that or expanding into that in a very, very big way. So we also have Neptune in the 7th house of relationship. Of course, it moves so slowly, and that Neptune is squaring Venus by about 7 degrees, a little bit less than 7 degrees. So that's not great. Neptune, Venus, again, is illusory. It's not showing up clearly what is actually happening. And there's going to be some disillusionment again around this marriage. It's not going to be easy for them. Let's go forward, if we move forward from the book release, and let's just jump a couple of months forward. So we're just going to do this in a really roughshod way. So we see that Saturn is crossing over the descendant, and so the ascendant-descendant axis is going to be affected by Saturn for most of the spring until late April, early May. Of course, Saturn entering the 7th house of marriage and relationships is really difficult anyway. It always shakes things up. It always creates a certain amount of tension in relationships and a need for reorganizing one's relationship. So we definitely are going to see in the next 2.5 years some of that. There's going to be quite a lot of reorganizing going on. Saturn is co-present with Neptune, and by the time it joins Neptune, that's going to create some real challenge as well, I think, that can lead to a lot of challenge in what their goals are, what they hope to achieve in the marriage. Not an easy thing to experience. We see, so at the same time that Saturn is moving in the 7th, we see that there's quite a lot of activity in their 8th house as well. So we've got Jupiter Chiron meeting up in the 8th house. There's a lot of healing is necessary. They might decide that they're going to kind of pull back, although, that doesn't seem to be true to their form, but they might feel the need to pull back and actually do some work on their marriage. We also see that Eris and Venus are conjoined there in the 8th house, and they are conjunct the Eris of the wedding still, because Eris moves so slowly, but of course Venus is still just a degree off, and they are in a sextile to the Venus. So this is Eris and Venus together can be very provocative. Venus in Aries is already not a terribly happy Venus. It's a very impulsive Venus. And Eris is again showing up everything that is hypocritical or not really being honest with one another. We see also that Eris and Venus together are in a square. Once again, it's a square with the moon. So this is really disruptive energy. So March, I think, is going to be a pretty rough ride for them. By the time that Mars moves on, I'm just going to push that forward until the end of March, where Mars is going to move on over the natal Venus. I think we're going to see that there can be some real frictions there, and then we're going to have Pluto on Mars. So I think that this marriage is actually going to be in quite a state of disarray. I think they're going to have to reconcile certain things, resolve a number of issues, because it's all really challenging aspects for now. It's very, very challenging energy for them right now. Pluto is going to go back and forth over that Mars, basically for all of 2023 and 2024. And it's already there now as I speak, but it's going to be exact by 2024. And nonetheless, even within a degree or two, it's still already very present and very obvious to them. So just to jump in and show Meghan's transits, personally, she is going to have quite a lot of challenging transits as well over this whole spring. There's quite a lot that she's going to have to grapple with. One thing being that Pluto is entering her 8th house on the south node. Pluto on the south node is about a complete overhaul of your life. That, as I mentioned before, is going to be happening all through 2023 and all through 2024. This is going to be one very, very challenging aspect. It's life-changing. And obviously, at the same time, her Mars is going to be conjunct the Ascendant at the Coronation. So her aspects in the spring are really, really challenging. She's going to have Chiron on her Eris, which is already a sensitive point in the chart, and Mars is in the first house trining that Saturn, and that Saturn will be trining Mars. She's going to feel really ambitious. She's going to feel, I think there's also some really positive Jupiter aspects. I don't have the time to go really deep into that, but she's definitely going to have a bit of a hard time of things in the spring. Just quickly look at the coronation date, and so that is, let me just fix the time. I'm going to give that an assumed time of 11:24. Just going to say it's 11:24. I have no idea what time it will be. It's usually around anywhere between 11 and 12. These things usually happen. So she's got Mars coming up on her ascendant around the time of the coronation. She has Pluto on the south node. There's going to be a marked change of status for her. Mars is in square to her natal Pluto, and that is a very hard aspect anyway. And to be doing something like that, to have something so dramatic in terms of royal coronation, a very sort of significant event for anybody, particularly for her under these circumstances, this is really very, very powerful stuff. Notice that the ascendant on the day is also at, again, if the time is assumed to be late morning, the ascendant is also on top of her north node, Mercury. So very, very intense stuff going on for her. The north node still in her 11th house, shaking up the area of friends, which Uranus has been doing also since 2018. And this is the area also of hopes and wishes and dreams. And that is going to be, as of July, going to be moving into her 10th house, a new role in the world, new way of showing up in the world. And the South Node is going to be moving towards a conjunction over the second half of 2023 with her Pluto. So Pluto South Node and then South Node Pluto, it's going to be a tough couple of years. It's going to be very hard to escape a need for radical change. And I suspect that that's going to come at the expense of the marriage, because I can't see, given their way of experiencing life, I can't see how that's really sustainable for both of them. So for Harry's transits, I did also point that out in the book release, but I'll just have a very quick look at his transits around the time of the coronation. I think also going to be, of course, deeply impactful for him. He's going to have Uranus on the moon. And again, remember how Taurian this royal family is. There is the day before this, there's going to be an eclipse. And this Taurus is a very important sign for the royal family. The other eclipse, so there's the eclipse of the 5th, and then there's also an eclipse which is on the 20th of April, 2 weeks before that. And that eclipse is going to be close to his midheaven and Saturn. So Harry is going through quite a lot as well around the time of the coronation. That is because Uranus is very close. It's approaching his moon. And that's very emotionally upsetting, very emotionally destabilizing. And that is, of course, a degree away from the nadir of the chart, the IC, opposing the midheaven. This is all about family for Harry. Very, very powerful. You've got Chiron on his Eris. That's the troublemaker in the family. And you also have the eclipse, which is going to happen on the 5th of May. The day before is, which is still active on the day of the coronation, is at 14 degrees and 52 minutes of Scorpio. And that's right between Harry's midheaven and Saturn. This is really huge stuff for Harry. This is really the end of something. He will probably get an invitation to the coronation, but whether he shows up would be, I think, very dubious with an eclipse on the midheaven. It would either completely demolish him and sort of seal his fate, or more likely is that he will just be eclipsed on the day. He just won't show up. And because that's the social house, that's the house of the public. So I suspect he's not going to bother to show up. And I would find it very difficult personally to show up after the goings-on of the last few years. The earlier eclipse on the 20th of April was at 29 of Aries in his 4th house of family, and that's what Jupiter is about to trigger. So that energy of the eclipse will be triggered when Jupiter crosses over in May, and that's going to happen quite quickly after the coronation. And so that eclipse is also going to be something to do with the wedding, the marriage, Jupiter representing marriage. And so that eclipse is going to show us something again about family and Harry's emotional state. This is the 4th house after all. That's house and home, family, emotions, psychology, and so on. Really, really heavy stuff. That same day, he's going to have Mars in the house of relationship. It is in conjunct with his natal Mars. I mean, it's just not good, is it? It's just really not good. Mars is going to be squaring Venus in the 10th house. Not good stuff at all. Yeah, I feel for him. Mars is in a sextile with the moon, but that feels heavy. That's emotional. Even if it's a sextile, Mars and the moon are not great together. And then, so the final thing to say about this, I think, is that we've got Venus, which is in almost an exact, like to 1 minute of a degree opposition to his Neptune. And I do feel like there's going to be some kind of waking up to a reality around Venusian things, relationships in general, and healing in particular, especially because this is the 6th house. And perhaps also even his wife. But of course it's in Gemini, so that can also entail issues around siblings, which is his primal wound, really, the brother connection and this challenge that he has about being the spare. Right, and so the one perhaps last thing to say is that there is, of course, this opposition with the sun and Saturn. So Sun-Saturn opposition is father and son conflict fundamentally, right? It's a big deal. Sun-Saturn opposition is hard, issues around authority, and that's happening on the day of the coronation. At the same time, we've got the South Node on Pluto, approaching Pluto to within 3 degrees exactly. So that won't be felt until later in the year. Probably June or July. And so, yeah, actually, it'll probably be more like late June into mid-July. And so that's something that is also going to be quite significant. There's going to be a major transformation, a major loss of some aspect of one's role socially, one's goals, one's hopes and wishes and dreams in terms of the future. And this is heavy stuff. I think this the transit to the coronation is possibly even more burdensome than it is with this book transit, which was bad enough. but this is very powerful. It suggests, especially because of the nodes, that there is a lot of permanent change that will be very painful, and I think show up in terms of the relationship with his wife as well. So not easy times. I think this spring is going to be a real test of the relationship. The next 2 years will be a very big test as Saturn moves through their 7th house, and provokes a need for change in the marriage. All right, thanks for listening this far, if you got this far. And I look forward to reading your comments below, and do let me know if I've forgotten things. I'm sure I have. So I always read your comments. I'm always interested to hear your perspective. Bye for now.